Business news now, and after a delay of nearly a week, China has finally released crucial economic data. Output grew by 3.9% over the third quarter. That's much better than expected, dashing fears that the delay was due to an official desire to obscure inconvenient data. But enduring weakness in the property sector continues to trouble investors. The Hong Kong benchmark share index slumped by more than 6% to a 14-year low, while mainland shares fell by 3%. Well, let's return to London, where Arise business correspondent Laurie Laird has more on the Chinese data, along with the other business headlines of the day. Great to see you again, Laurie. Let's start with Chinese GDP data, not nearly as bad as feared.
No, and no one could figure out why this data set was delayed. GDP grew by 3.9% in the third quarter of the year. That's a lot higher than analysts were looking for. They were looking for about 3.3, 3.4%. And it's crucial that I point out that 3.9% growth refers to both year-over-year growth, which is the Chinese government's preferred way of referring to growth. And sometimes when you look at year-over-year, it does point to a higher number. But the economy also grew by 3.9% on a quarter-over-quarter basis, so the third quarter over the second quarter, which is also pretty healthy growth. For the third, we haven't seen third quarter numbers out of any other big economy yet, but we are looking for perhaps even negative growth in the third quarter from the UK, from the European Union, and perhaps very sluggish growth out of the US. The US data come out on Thursday. So this was a very good number, both quarter on quarter and year on year. That said, the Chinese economy had a dreadful second quarter, so we did expect some kind of Q-on-Q, quarter-on-quarter improvement in the third quarter. So much, much better numbers than people thought. However, we did see a bit of weakness toward the end of the quarter in September. Retail sales grew by very, very little. Industrial production up a little bit, up by more than expected, but still not the sort of 15-20% growth that we were seeing before the pandemic.
So, I mean, if there wasn't sort of an official desire to obscure what you described as inconvenient data, why the delay in releasing the numbers?
I wish I knew, Charles, and everybody has been scratching their head about this, because when those data were delayed, they were meant to come out last Tuesday at the same time that the Communist Party conference was happening. And so the assumption was, all right, China doesn't want bad numbers to overshadow the party conference, as it turned. And so we all assumed that they would be bad numbers. It turns out these aren't particularly bad numbers at all. From the Chinese government's point of view, perhaps they're bad. They're way off the 5.5% growth that China has set up as its annual target. They'll have a long way to go to try and hit that target. But these were not particularly bad numbers, so no one can quite figure out why these numbers were delayed. If only, the only explanation seems to be that they wanted no data coming out while the party conference was coming on. But certainly the release today was a little bit unusual. Usually these data come out and there is a press conference and journalists can ask questions about the numbers. None of this today. There was no warning that these were coming out. They just sort of appeared on the wires.
Nevertheless, Laurie, you have to admit that these are hardly strong numbers, and investors as well dumping shares in Hong Kong and on the mainland.
Absolutely. And when I say these are better than expected, you're right to put that caveat on it. These are not fantastic numbers, simply stronger than expected. And I think and this fall in Hong Kong shares is massive. They were down almost 8% earlier in the session, made up some of those losses, down 6.5% at the end of the day. The Chinese mainland index, CSI 300, down about 3%. It's not so much what was in these numbers that is concerning investors right now. It's what wasn't said at that Communist Party conference. There was very little focus on the economy at that conference, despite the fact that we can see the Chinese economy is slowing very, very rapidly. Xi Jinping, in his main address, his main 2-hour address, used the word security more than 6 times more than he did use the word economics. That is a concern for investors, and the feeling is that Xi Jinping is going to carry on with self-security, self-sufficiency, whether that be in food, in chips, and he is not so much concerned about the private sector, about opening markets, about doing all of the things that have been done to the Chinese economy over the past 20 or 30 years to make it the power that it is right now. Xi Jinping has, over the past 18 months or so, has really engaged in a crackdown on corruption, on preventing tech bosses that have done so much to generate economic growth in China, has really cracked down on these entrepreneurs. And there was no sense at all in his words that he might stop doing that. He got rid of his key economic advisor, the Prime Minister Li Keqiang, at the Communist Party conference. All of these things are telling investors that China is probably going to become a less hospitable place to invest.
Right. Let's move away from China, Laurie, and turn to the Eurozone. Some weak data there as well, apparently.
Terrible data out today. These are called purchasing managers indexes, and they're not a measure of actual output. It's a measure of business sentiment, but they come out so early in the month that markets really do pay attention to these indicators. We got a very weak reading, 47.1 in the Eurozone. And just to put that in a bit of context, anything below a level of 50, and again, this is a slightly arbitrarily derived index, but anything below a level of 50 suggests a contraction in economic activity. Anything over 50 suggests an expansion. Now, this is the third straight month of this reading coming in below 50. It's the reading for September, which does give a suggestion that we may see the Eurozone having slipped into a contraction in the third quarter of the year. And of course, a contraction in one quarter is halfway to the definition of a recession, which is 2 consecutive quarters of contraction. So not looking at all good for the Eurozone based on these data out this morning.
Well, I suppose the big question is, what does this mean for the European Central Bank? I mean, we're expecting an interest rate decision later this week, aren't we?
Absolutely. And you're right. It is a massive question for the ECB. They have been accused of starting to raise interest rates far too slowly to combat inflation, which is running at just below 10% in the Eurozone. That is the highest it's been since the Eurozone was formed. So they face this, and we're looking at pictures of the ECB in front of us. It puts the ECB in a dreadful position. Your economy may be going into recession. You're facing very, very high inflation. What do you do with interest rates? Do you affect another very big hike like they did at their last meeting, 0.75 of a percentage point? Perhaps, but also central bankers are saying, including at the ECB, we don't know how long it takes between putting in place these interest rate hikes and when that will slow the economy down. It sometimes takes 12 to 18 months before interest rate hikes start to tackle inflation. Does that mean we can go too far too quickly, given that the economy is slowing? Difficult situation. We talked earlier, Charles, about who would want to be UK Prime Minister. I'm not sure who would want to be a central banker right now either.
The number cruncher, Laurie Laird, Arise business correspondent, talking to me there from London.